Homecoming RK equals Part 9 RK equals Flag Bridge RSN Cruiser Praetorian Rondon. The last thing Tyene saw of Vale was a pleasant smile at all things, and then the Sith cut off the channel. Set the fleet on condition 1. Do not make any provocative moves towards the Republic ships and keep on station. The Council ordered. Decades of service in the Merchant Marine, capped by long years in the RSN, were the only reason he kept the profound sense of relief and the overwhelming shame he felt from showing in his voice. Put Rear Admiral Zellick on. A ghostly visage of a Techno-Union cyborg wearing a gleaming silver armor materialized in front of the Council. The Rear Admiral had so many implants hiding his fleshly bits that all Sulla could tell about the man that he was likely male and certainly humanoid. Even the files intelligence had on him were vague about his species or place of origin. Admiral Zellick. What is your concern? Tyene asked in a neutral tone. Your actions can be considered cowardice in the face of the enemy. The cyborg's words were clear and precise, more mechanical sounding than the speech of most droids. I'm aware of that. I won't see my world burn today, and I have the full backing of the Senate in this. That's a first, Council Tyene. I do understand your concerns. Have your forces stand down. If you make any move that can be considered threatening or interpreted as a prelude to switch sides, we will do what we have to. Do keep in mind that my superiors might not be so understanding. Zellick out. Yet another blaster bolt dodged. Sulla turned his attention to the tactical plot where he saw the Republic fleet spreading its formation a bit. Then they opened fire from far out of anyone's effective range. And just with 5 ships? Tactical, I need an analysis on what the Sith thinks he's doing. Being a world-destroying bastard unfortunately didn't mean that Vale was a fool. He wouldn't be wasting ammunition, especially after being out of contact with the Republic's famous logistics network for months now. We can confirm that only 5 ships are shooting. Unknown designs that match the descriptions of the new units Vale's people supposedly bought at Nar Shaddaa. Are those mass driver slugs? Who in their right mind would use? Tactical? The Council's patience snapped. Apologies, sir. Enemy ECM makes proper sensor sweeps impossible. Visuals tell us that those ships have spinal-mounted mass drivers of some sort, coil guns, railguns or gravitic-launched. Observed speed of the projectiles, approximately 30% of light speed. Time to impact, 12 seconds. First salvo impacting now. No time for the Confederate ships to evade if they got caught as off guard as his own people. How effective would such a weapon be? Give me a sensor image of the hit ships, a holographic window open to his right to display a close-up image from a weapon's satellite constellation. A Confederate battleship was listing to the side. Its command sphere had its armor shattered and its front sprouted a deep burning chasm. Tyene had a front row seat of the second barrage hitting home. 2 of the shots missed the sphere, with one going wild and the second ramming its way into the battleship's outer hull. The comparatively lighter armor there broke apart in the middle of a blinding explosion. The other 3 shots buried themselves deep into the command sphere before detonating too. It pained the Council to imagine the grievous damage those caused even before exploding. They hit something vital too, because mere seconds later the command sphere vanished into a blinding explosion when the hypermatter reactor housed in there went critical. Those aren't just kinetics. Tactical? Sensors? Sulla demanded information. Some kind of fusion charge. From observation alone it's obvious those munitions are rigged to detonate just after impact, when they have penetrated into the armor or decks of the target for maximum damage. Recommendations: keep away from their firing arcs. That much made sense. Until the Confederate fleet could calculate a hyperspace insertion and jump in the face of the Republic fleet, they would get mauled. Unless Admiral Zellick should be ordering a switch to particle shielding. Observe the effects of the Republic munitions closely. We're on it, sir. Council, the Speaker of the Senate is on the comm for you. She claims it is an emergency. Put her in. That was all he needed. Further complications. An elderly statuesque woman appeared in a new holographic window, this time on the council's left. She had her long silver hair left unbound as many a Randoni preferred. Her sharp brown eyes looked sharp as ever, however even the best makeup couldn't hide how bone-weary the woman appeared. Speaker Iona, the situation up here is volatile. Please speak plainly. It's no better down here. The speaker manipulated a controller out of the camera's view and the holographic window separated to show feeds from various places on the homeworld. News of the Sith's survival and arrival just broke. We already had protests and wakes all over the planet demanding we don't provoke the same response as Bothoi. Tierney winced when he saw a protest on one of the largest marketplaces on the surface turning ugly in a heartbeat. Fires reflected over gleaming towers of the space scrapers surrounding the plaza and endless waves of rioters clashed with legions of riot police backed up by the army. For what it's worth, we have the Sith's reassurance that we would be left alone as long as we don't bar his way. His fleet is currently engaging the Confederate units under Rear Admiral Zellick. If the situation here deteriorates, we might not have a choice but try pursuing a neutral stance in the war. People are terrified that Vale will turn his gaze our way, and as you know, the next elections are in 2 months. Our Confederate friends might have a thing or two to say about that. The Council didn't bother pointing out that despite all the terror caused by Vale, it was the Confederacy who was winning the war, yet that might yet change. In that regard, the Sith returning to the core might turn into a blessing in disguise if his presence there shattered what was left of the Republic. We're aware of that. The speaker continued. That why was she calling at a time like this? If the Senate had new orders to convey, she would have done it already. What game was she playing? Tierney's eyes narrowed and he muted the channel. Calms, check the broadcast channels on the surface. Is my conversation with the speaker streamed live? While awaiting a confirmation one way or another, the Council looked back at the tactical plot. 2 more Confederate battleships were out of action along with 5 munificents. Now that the particle shields were up rapidly charging with power transferred from the deflectors, the potency of the long-ranged bombardment was steadily diminishing. That would mean soon it would be useless. It was a nice trick, but after the initial surprise it was easy to counter. Particle shields would stop further such bombardment cold. How long exactly since the Republic fleet arrived? Tierney asked. With their deflectors down, there was no way Zellick was going to jump in the face of the Republic fleet. However, 3 minutes and counting. Would the Sith consider warning Zellick about what Tierney suspected was about to happen, a provocation if the cyborg hadn't figured out his blunder already? Did he dare take such a risk? It became a moot point. The Republic fleet blinked out of existence only to appear a heartbeat later above and a bit in front the Confederate formation. The enemy ships were already swinging down and opening fire. One glance told the Council that the Republic ships would sweep over Zellick's fleet and maul them with their turbolasers. The cyborg wouldn't even be able to use his frigates for the now infamous Confederate ramming tactics. The vectors simply didn't work for it. The best chance Zellick had was to keep on course, brace for impact and make a tactical jump to hyperspace to avoid suffering any more losses that he absolutely had to. Sir, I can confirm, multiple news channels are broadcasting your conversation with the speaker. Good for her. The Council could appreciate her cunning. Hopefully, his words would have been enough to calm down some segments of the population. Thank you. Tierney looked back at the speaker and unmuted the channel. Madam Speaker, at this time I have no reason to believe that either the Republic forces in system are a clear and present danger for Rondon unless provoked. I've given orders to avoid such actions. I'll inform you and the Senate if there are any new developments. Council Tierney, out. He cut off the channel and refocused on watching the battle. A third of Zellick's fleet died in front of the Council's eyes for no real gain before the Confederate forces could jump to safety. 15 seconds later, a second, much smaller Republic fleet exited hyperspace on a vector that kept them far away from both the RSN and Zellick's ships. A heading that would meant they soon would be leaving the system for Kashyyyk. He ran the numbers in his head, and it would be a miracle if Zelik could attempt an intercept before the enemy escaped in hyperspace. After that display, the Council was very glad he didn't have to engage any force commanded by that Sith, no matter if the man could destroy whole worlds himself or not. =RK=, Part 10, =RK=, Observation Lounge, Republic Cruiser Solace, Hyperspace. I couldn't really believe the plan actually worked, nor could I shake off the feeling that sooner or later the other shoe was about to drop. By all means, we should have been engaged by a much more powerful separatist force at Rondon. While the local SDF being reasonably terrified by my very presence was a nice boost to my ego and made me cackle internally, they shouldn't have really been a factor anyway. The Confederacy should have had enough of their own navy in place to give us a run for our money. Instead, we faced a fleet that didn't outnumber us by much, and we managed to inflict significant casualties without a single cruiser losing its shields, though some energy bleed-through caused stress damage to power systems and emitters that were long overdue for proper repair and in a lot of cases outright replacement. Did we overestimate what the Separatists can afford to commit in hunting us down? I thought aloud. We don't have enough information to tell. Joanna's response was decidedly unhelpful. She at least was happy at the one-sided slaughter we delivered at Rondon. My Admiral was still not over losing her precious freedom, which was a reminder to get her a nice brand battle cruiser or even a Star Dreadnought if the opportunity ever presented itself. Either that or we're about to fly into a trap. Kashyyyk is an important gateway to Separatist space. Securing that system would tremendously help the enemy's logistics in this whole quadrant of space. We both knew that when we left, the strategic plans called for bleeding the enemy but ultimately abandoning the system. Making a stand at Kashyyyk without the benefit of powerful orbital defenses, much less planetary shields on the ground or enough infrastructure to risk committing sufficient forces in such an exposed location would have been sheer folly. Given the strategic situation, Kashyyyk is significantly more valuable to the Separatists than to us. They have incentive to fortify the place, Joanna continued. It's fortunate that we don't have to actually capture or even relieve any defenders still holding out. I actually did harbor such dreams once upon a time, before the Bothans stabbed us in the back. Without access to reinforcements and the repair facilities at Bothoi, our only option was to continue our flight to friendly space and fight only when and where we absolutely had to. Otherwise, we would still be back at Rondon, doing our best to reduce that separatist fleet. For all we knew, even now it was chasing us, yet if we wasted time there, enemy reinforcements could have arrived and made our position untenable. There's that. 6 hours and we're back in Republic space, even if it's currently under enemy control. Joanna commented. 2 more jumps after that, and once we recover at Tanab, we hit Mandalore. After that, I trailed off and looked Joanna in the eyes. She straightened up. Corellia. Her face twisted in an angry and pained grimace. We'll do our part, General. We all know what is at stake. I know, Joanna. Go get a bit of rest. We'll be back on our station in 5 hours. The Admiral left and I was alone on the former bridge. It was curious how easily I accepted the Mandalorians as my people. Yet, in retrospect, it made sense. Despite Satine's new Mandalorians' cultural abomination, they were the ones that still made sense in this messed-up future. Everything, the Jedi, the Republic, the so-called Sith of this era, they were all wrong. It was only in the Mandalorians, a few soldiers and a handful of Jedi that I saw some fire I associated with both friend and foes. I knew intellectually that 1,000 years of peace was a great thing for the most of the galaxy, yet it had made people complacent. Asleep. This war of ours, it brought both the best and worst in everyone. It stripped all pretenses and bared the hearts of men and women alike. Besides, what else did I have left, besides people that I chose as my own just as they chose me as their leader? =RK=, CIC, Confederate Dreadnought Hunter, TF Serpent Slayer Flagship, Rondon, TK-51 felt frustration spreading through its droid brain. There were multiple factors he could blame on why it took so long for his task force to be assembled and unleashed to hunt down the Sith. He could even agree with some of those reasons: an inevitable delay to finish upgrading some new ships under his command with full network nodes, updating and upgrading the droid crews as well. It did take time, especially when the technicians doing it were becoming steadily more paranoid. It took some time for TK-51 to figure out why, and the reason came as a surprise. They were afraid of him and his fellow droids becoming too smart and independent, which was illogical, considering that this was the point of all the changes in the first place. It took him a lot of time calculating that inconsistency. Even longer to comprehend the result and how even reaching it could be a problem. For TK-51 shouldn't have been able to conceive of a rebellion and it being the reason why his creators and masters were wary of him. Yet, he did reach such a conclusion. TK-51 was still compelled to follow orders. He did check, so everything was supposedly all right, surely. However, he couldn't shake off the increasing frustration with the ever-increasing number of tests and delays that kept him from catching up with his quarry. If the Admiralty cut off the orders just a few hours earlier, TK-51's task force would have arrived in time to ambush Vale. Instead, he arrived in time to take stock of the situation, to conclude that the Sith had pulled yet another supposedly impossible trick, the single most one-sided battle since the start of the whole war. In fact, what happened at Rondon wasn't a battle but a massacre. TK-51 and its subordinate droid commanders went over Admiral Lorik's reports with machine speed and precision. They used the significant processing capacity they now had available thanks to the network nodes installed on multiple major combatants across the fleet to conclude within seconds that capturing Vale's fleet before he reached friendly space and reinforcements was unlikely, though there were options that might increase the probability. Like ordering the standing forces between Rondon and Kashyyyk to do everything they could to slow down the enemy's transit. That, however, could fail for one simple reason: the objective wasn't the interception and destruction of that enemy fleet, it was the assassination of General Delcatar Vale. The tactical droid called the local star charts to the front of his awareness along with what he knew about his target. He knew where Vale was going, and taking into account even a brief time for respite and repairs at the closest Republic naval base, TK-51 could beat the Sith to Mandalore and prepare the battleground. Conclusion reached, he called command to apprise them of the situation and request the forces he deemed necessary to ensure a success of his mission. The long road to Mandalore =RK=, Part 1 =RK=, Observation Lounge, Republic Cruiser Solace, Kashyyyk. The ambush I feared waited for us failed to materialize a second time in a row. That didn't really make me feel any better. Sensor feeds streamed from the CIC showed me the disposition of all detected enemy assets. A battle group hung above Kashyyyk in a close support formation with multiple freighters and engineering vessels that were busy assembling a few Golan battle stations. There were faint sensor ghosts that indicated either minefields, weapon platforms trying to be inconspicuous, or both. All our sensors could tell us about Kashyyyk was what we already knew. It was a lush forest world with a lot of rivers, lakes and more than a few seas, with the odd oceans spread out across the surface. The last time I was ground-side, there were some pleasant places to visit, and I did hold a few fond memories with Ashara of that world. Still, it's been close to 4 millennia, and who knew how things had changed even before the Separatists arrived. Enemy jamming prevented us from getting anything from the surface or pushing messages to anyone friendly down there. The Separatists' force in orbit was a tempting target. Hitting those stations before they could come online would be good. However, bait or not, I refused to bite. Admiral, we're heading straight for our next jump. Ignore the enemy forces at Kashyyyk unless they move to intercept us. The last thing this fleet needed was an unnecessary engagement that might very well be a trap. I had to assume that Separatist fleet we left behind at Rondon was tailing us, possibly with reinforcements. We would still need to pass though 1 or 2 systems controlled by the enemy, and that was if we were lucky and Tanab was still in friendly hands. Still, letting such juicy targets unmolested offended my sensibilities. 20 tense minutes later, the supply ships and their escorts jumped towards Lantilles and we followed in their wake. There was still no trace of enemy ambush. What were the separatists planning? RK equals Observation Lounge, Republic Cruiser Solace, Lantilles. A day later, we entered Lantilles and finding a lot of enemy ships waiting for us, there was actually a relief. 6 distinct battle groups that when combined outnumbered us close to 3-1 patrolled the system. Half of those flew on vectors that would allow them to easily plot a hyperspace insertion near any ships that arrived from Kashyyyk. While the enemy numbers were still quite a bit fewer than I feared, and I wouldn't be surprised if they had more in reserve waiting for their obvious forces to pin us down before pouncing, I was still glad that the other shoe finally dropped. Besides, I did have a few surprises up my sleeve, like the silencers that I didn't have to unleash at Rondon. Now the trick was going to be getting the mobile dock and the supply ships safely away without getting ourselves killed. They still trailed behind, and unless we called them to expedite their arrival, were 30 minutes behind despite leaving earlier. I saw Joanna's staff designate the enemy battle groups Reaper 1 to 6, with the first 3 being the ones in a position to intercept us. Target Reaper 1 with the daggers. Let's see how they would play this. Have half the silencers on standby along with the special payloads. I ordered. If those ships wanted to jump into effective range, they would need to keep their deflectors up and rely on evasion for avoiding the railgun rounds. And while the enemy battleships did have respectable straight-line acceleration, they were never the most agile of combatants. With the fire rate of the daggers, they could bracket and reasonably expect to hit a ponderous Lucree hulk at up to 3 or 4 light seconds, depending on respective speed and approach vectors of the converging fleets. On my mark, go to maximum deceleration and shift formation alignment 40-60 degrees up, I continued. My latest orders were a risk. I know what would be the logical thing for the enemy to do in such a situation. It was quite obvious what their 6 formations implied. The question was if they were smart enough and good enough to risk something like that instead of going with a more conventional and crude tactic. 2 crippled battleships and 1 obliterated munificent that got particularly unlucky later, the enemy jumped at us, bracketing us on 3 sides. The separatist commander deposited a battle group on each of our flanks, with the third one, Reaper 2, which got the daggers' undivided attention, arriving above us. The bastards had learned. Their formations and coordination was still crude, as one might expect, however they were doing their best to maximize the firepower at the points of contact between our fleets. If they were able to bring their remaining 3 battle groups to bear and didn't criff things up, they should be able to win. At least in theory. In practice, there were various ways to mitigate the effects of their tactics, and that was without having access to my pride and joy. 20 seconds after Reaper 2 exited hyperspace to find it was badly undershot its desired position due to our last-moment change in speed and direction, it got 2 of its remaining battleships crippled by silencers. Their remaining capital ships received the undivided attention of the daggers instead of bypassing their firing arcs by exiting hyperspace too close above them. The same was true to a lesser extent for the enemy flanking forces. One of them undershot its mark while the other did overshoot, so instead of finding ourselves in the middle of a 3-sided crossfire, we managed to tear the heart of Reaper 2 before engaging Reaper 1 for good. 1 high-speed pass later and our hyperdrives were ready for another jump, and we had the coordinated locked for further in-system. We exited real space for a few seconds just in time to avoid the other Reaper elements from jumping right on top of us. Now it was time to make them really made and firmly fix their attention on us. Turn us around, have another jump calculated and the coordinates ready. I ordered and finally allowed myself to look over what our sensors and tactical had for me on the situation at large within the system. There were lots of debris and wrecks in orbit around Lantilles. This was a wealthy sector capital relatively close to Hutt space, so they could never afford to be complacent in their security or gain any weird pacifistic notions. While that obviously hadn't been enough to keep the separatists from taking control of the system, the wrecks and damaged ships in orbit told me that the locals and the Republic Navy had pulled one hell of a fight before retreating. From our position before the in-system jump, we could see no less than 12 battleship wrecks surrounded by a whole ghost fleet made of Republic and Separatists hulks at the Lantilles L2 point. The power readings and jamming coming from the planet meant that there were theater shields on, even though the huge beacon of a full planetary one was conspicuously missing. Sabotage, treason, the enemy getting lucky? I guess I would find out once we got back to a Republic-controlled system. General, we just received a transmission from the asteroid field surrounding the outer system. It's from someone claiming to be Commander Jolin Nabi, of the Lantilli Space Defense Forces frigate Sweet Dreams. We can't confirm their recognition codes, though they do appear genuine. As you know, those we have available are out of date, and we didn't have the latest war books covering this part of the galaxy when we left. Admiral Holt informed me. What does he want? We received an intelligence update of known enemy dispositions, both on the ground and in space, records of separatist ships transiting the system over the last few weeks too, among other things. Tactical and our intelligence officers are going over the raw data as we speak. After our display so far, the good commander, if he's for real, has no doubt we're friendly, so he sent us everything his ship has gathered up to this point. He has been there for the past 16 days after relieving another scout vessel keeping an eye of the enemy. Wasn't that interesting? What does he claim about Geyser, if anything? This certainly perked my interest. Better put him on. RK equals. Part 2. RK equals. Observation Lounge. Republic Cruiser Solace. Lantilles. Commander Nabi was a thin, reedy man with the distinct long limbs and height of someone born and raised in low-gravity environment. For a human, such a thing had been unusual 4,000 years ago, much less today. Such adaptation didn't give any tangible advantages for members of species not evolved in low-gravity environment. Anyone sane who had the choice avoided having children and then raising them on worlds with gravity significantly lower than one standard G-ways around that had been abundant in the past, before millennia of further spread and growth of civilization and industrial bases. For someone serving in the navy of a sector capital? While there might be a plausible explanation, his appearance alone was enough to ring alarm bells in my head. That begged the question, why wasn't Joanna even more wary about the commander and his information? Did she know something I didn't? I would be asking later. Commander Nabi, General Vale. I understand you've been busy these past couple of weeks. Please summarize the most relevant data about the Separatist space forces in the area. I didn't get the expected reaction of him after my introduction, and it took me a moment to figure out why he had been stuck here, maintaining comm discipline since before Bothoi. If he was telling the truth anyway. Instead of being scared, horrified or disgusted, what I could vaguely perceive through the comm link was relief. According to my emphatic sense, it appeared to be genuine too, though that wasn't saying much. A traitor would be relieved that those who he wanted to betray were willing to listen to him. 3 days ago a separatist fleet went to raid Geyser. It was about half the strength of the ships they had here upon your arrival, sir. This area has been relatively quiet since the enemy took control of the system. I believe the Confederacy has been concentrating their efforts in taking Zeltros so they could open an additional supply lane to Kamena and the rest of the core. Last I heard, Manon, Kona and Emrys still held, however they were under heavy assault with the enemy attempting to reduce our forces in their sectors and secure their lines of communication. They've been cut off ever since Lantilles fell. An interesting insight in the strategic situation. If true, we might have to get out of here promptly. For all I knew, the Separatists had recalled a lot of their forces in the region and they might be dropping in any moment now. As soon as our supply train was on its way to Geyser, we would be leaving. Geyser is still holding then? I focused on the commander as I asked the question. It was vital to know the truth. More or less. At least that was the case 2 weeks ago. Nabi nodded in emphasis. Most of our surviving forces fell in good order to Geyser, and in conjunction with the local defense fleet and additional Republic reinforcements, they've kept the system contested. Geyser herself was untouched when we passed through on our way here, though not for lack of trying. The Separatists managed to significantly reduce the orbital defenses and wrecked at least half of the orbital infrastructure. He seemed genuine. What I could see with my eyes told me as much, and I could hear how earnest he was. Nor could I sense deception through the Force, However, when using it that way, through a comm channel, it wasn't entirely reliable. "Sir, with you back, we can surely get back on the offensive," Nabi continued. "We've been stalemated for months all across the quadrant, and there isn't sufficient support from the core to do anything but hold the line and hope it's enough. You're one of the most renowned Republic generals, and Mandalore too. They will listen to you on Coruscant. We need more ships, more people and supplies to push the Separatists back," Nabi outright pleaded. "The Criff has been happening while I was away? My knowledge of the political and military situation of the Republic as a whole was patchy at best and far from up to date. I've been hoping that with Satine as Chancellor and Obi-Wan in charge of the GAR, they would have kicked the Republic war machine in a high gear despite any obstacles they might be facing. However, the way the commander looked at me with desperate hope that I would shake things up didn't fill me up with confidence. I intend to, Commander. We will get our homes back and make the enemy pay tenfold for what they did and are still doing to our people." My words came unbidden, and only after I said them I figured out that I meant every single one of them. "Good." Nabi sagged with relief. "The situation down on Lantilles is bad, and all we could do was helplessly watch from the outer system. Commander, reposition and go silent. We'll see what we can do to make liberating your home easier when we come back." I was reasonably sure that he was for real, though I wouldn't count on his intelligence to be complete or truthful. It wasn't like we had a realistic option besides Jiza. It was the one viable route towards Republic space from here. The alternatives were going deep into enemy territory or making our way towards a hyperlane the slow way, which simply wasn't an option. I looked at the projection of the tactical situation. The enemy battle groups had almost finished their turns and would soon be able to come after us through in-system hyper-insertions. We had almost 20 minutes left before the supply ships would arrive, and I would need the enemy to be out of position to molest them when that happened. I looked at the icons of the Separatist ships and wondered what would their commander do. A well-trained and experienced fleet with the number the Separatists still had would be enough to make our lives very, very difficult. It was fortunate that properly learning to coordinate and utilize multiple independent formations in maneuver warfare took a long time to master. Otherwise, our first encounter would have ended much, much less one-sided. Would the enemy gather his force in two larger fleets or continue to play with a smaller formation? The one we mauled did dissipate, and its remaining ships spread out among Reaper 1 and 3. The remaining battle groups didn't move to join together. That was probably good news. It kept the option of defeating them in detail on the table, though on the downside, if they didn't mess up again, the situation would become tougher. At least after Nar Shaddaa we had the fuel for some creative maneuvering of our own, otherwise we would have been deep trouble already. Now, what would I do if I was in the shoes of the enemy commander? The answer was simple, really. Put one or two of the battle groups right in our faces and then flank us with the rest. We would get mauled fighting our way through such an improvised blockade at a knife-range slugging match would bring my dagger destroyers and silencer-equipped ships within enemy range. Those would be the primary targets along with my flagship if they could locate it. "Joanna, we're going to concentrate our firepower to the front of our formation. I want all lighter ships pulled to the outer flanks. Daggers and silencers at the back within mutual support range. Enemy frigates are primary targets." It was a complex maneuver, with ships accelerating or decelerating and moving in all directions within our formation. Without a week spent training first the dagger crews and then the rest of my force into the ground, I wouldn't have dared attempt something like this without battle meditation. The fact that by now many of the crews were veterans accustomed to working together after months of battles helped tremendously too. I hoped that I made the correct assumption. The light ships covering our flanks were going to be mauled for one last time. We didn't have that many escorts left, and even if I guessed right, they were going to play their role and pay the price for it. And if I was mistaken, many if not all of those crews were going to die for no gain. If the enemy decided to come for a high-speed strafing run with his formations instead the slugging match that I bet on, it was going to get very ugly. I felt a warning coming through the force, and I knew that the Separatists just entered hyperspace.